Jesus didn't even want to be in the desert. The Spirit led him there. This wasn't his idea. This wasn't his chosen fast. Few people choose the desert if they have a choice. Certainly not someone who spends most of his time around waters and fish and fields. In the desert, there is no thundering voice of God announcing your belovedness, no reinforcing words of pride to make you feel valuable and chosen. In the desert, Jesus knew he was alone and in need, led into the desert by a Spirit only recently descended into his life, according to Luke's gospel. And the devil came to him. Not the little horned man in the red Halloween suit, in my mind, but the word we use to describe the way evil so often seems to be directed with purpose. Evil with purpose that seems to compete for our allegiance, the sort of evil that leads a man to dream up a pointless war in Ukraine and enables a military to unleash the hell that war creates. The sort of evil that led to slavery and still holds the hearts of many of us captive, oppressing generations of people of color here and around the globe. The sort of evil that carved up our neighborhoods by race and income years ago and still keeps hurting and dividing us. The devil came to Jesus because Jesus showed such obvious need. It seems that corrupt power often seeks out places of legitimate need. Corrupt power corrupts our desires, refashions it toward its own malevolent purposes. In the wilderness, Jesus was as needy as ever. He needed food. He needed power or agency. He needed protection. He needed companionship. And the devil was right there to please. Look for the places of legitimate need, and there you will find evil with a purpose ready to pounce. But Jesus says no to the devil's method of survival. One does not live by bread alone. Bread is important, but bread itself does not feed an empty soul. More stuff does not feed an empty heart. More stuff cannot mend a broken spirit. Self-preservation is an important value, but by itself, it does not make life worth living. Jesus says no to the devil's kind of power. There is only one God, and this God does not exercise power against human life and freedom, but for it. And Jesus says no to the devil's kind of success. He will not use God's name for his own personal agenda. Jesus says no because he knows that the devil's promises, as tempting as they are in the loneliness of the wilderness, won't meet the deep need that he actually encounters. They will only make things worse. It's not that Jesus rejects the human need for bread or power or recognition and success. It's that he knows there are alternatives to the devil's way of meeting those needs. And I think the devil would like us to think otherwise. All you have to do is read the newspapers, walk the streets, listen to the either-or thinking that sometimes passes for reality. Just visit one of our many neighborhoods in our city where the conspiracy of race and fossil-fueled suburban fantasies hollowed out some of our communities over time. Here there is a legitimate need for protection. Here there is a legitimate need for security that comes through family bonds. And the devil has a strategy to meet that need. There's a legitimate need for jobs and decent wages, and the devil has a drug strategy to meet that need. There's a legitimate need to share anger with a world that doesn't seem to care, and the devil has a violent strategy to meet the need. And when we get tired of the violence, the devil has a stop and frisk policy just waiting to come back out of the shadows. Evil with a purpose has lots of strategies waiting in the wings. All we have to do is decide we are out of alternatives. Maybe you've seen the devil's work on the televised sins of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where ordinary civilians are facing down tanks and soldiers and their guns. Putin wanted power, and the devil had a war strategy all planned out and ready to go. I pray that this plan doesn't lead more world leaders into the human fantasy that war is the best way to solve our problems. You see, the devil only gets to us when we convince ourselves that there is no other way to meet those needs. Temptation never finds us when our legitimate needs are fulfilled in life-giving ways. Corrupted power never comes to greet us when relationships are going well, our vocation is fulfilling, our personal or national security is stable, our contributions to the world are being affirmed. No, this kind of temptation only greets us when we are wounded and in pain, in need of power, or in need of acknowledgement, or in need of human connection. This kind of temptation only greets us when we are alone and weakened in the wilderness, not of our choosing, and then decide that we are out of alternatives. And Jesus resists successfully. 40 days without food, and he resists. Famished, hungry, lonely, hurting, and Jesus resists, maybe because he knows that with God, there are almost always many alternatives. The church has often taken from this story how different Jesus seems to be from us. Tempted as we are, yet without sin, the book of Hebrews says. And I suppose that is true and maybe sometimes worth accentuating. But I think perhaps a more important observation for us this year is that Jesus seems to know that he doesn't need the devil in the desert to meet his legitimate needs. There are other ways to deal with your hunger in the wilderness. There are other ways to deal with your lack of power in the wilderness. There are other ways to deal with your loneliness, your need for connection in the wilderness. We worship the God of alternatives. Our theme for Lent this year, Full to the Brim, probably struck a number of you as odd, since so many of us are accustomed to thinking about Lent as a time of chosen deprivation, a wilderness time when we voluntarily give stuff up so we can sort of prepare ourselves to receive the grace that comes at Easter. And yet the authors of this theme pointed out that the texts that accompany our Lenten journey this year so often are texts of abundance and plenty. And those same authors pointed out that acts of abuse and injustice are often rooted in shame and scarcity. Mark Douglas, my ethics professor from seminary, wrote an article arguing that Lent is actually practiced in most places. The way that it's practiced makes poor theological sense. Why? Well, because if grace is always a surprise, then how can you prepare yourself for that? Easter is a shock of divine goodness, Douglas writes, that reveals not the evidence of our worth or the magnitude of our efforts, but God's astounding power to which we can but whisper, "Thank you," and not, "Okay, now I'm ready." I think about all those Russian dissenters who have boldly opposed their dictator's heartless human disaster of war. Right before the war started, I heard people who know what they're talking about saying there is no meaningful opposition in Russia. Grace is always a surprise. I think about the abundance of volunteer time, energy, and gifts that suddenly appeared when our Ministry of Welcome announced we had an opportunity to support Afghan refugees who are already here. Grace, surprise. I think about the joy that I felt this past Tuesday night with some of you playing a game of hide and seek in the sanctuary with our children and a few hardy adults who hadn't gathered together for a meal in nearly 2 years. Grace, surprise. If there is a difference between Jesus and us, maybe the one worth noting this year is that Jesus believes grace can be found even in the wilderness. To be clear, no one wants to go there voluntarily, not even Jesus. Few people choose the desert if they have a choice, certainly not someone who spends most of his time around waters and fish and fields. And yet Jesus was never alone. At least that's the way I read this text. Remember, the Spirit led him there. The text never says that the Spirit left him there. People sometimes ask me, how is it that you seem to maintain hope with the world as it is, with COVID as it is, with the racial injustice in our country as it is, and the planet pushed to unprecedented levels, all by people grasping for power that isn't theirs to own? How do you maintain hope when the city can't get itself together or the violence goes on and on unabated? I've thought a lot about this question because I honestly don't really know. All my rational answers don't make sense at the end of the day. I feel as cynical and out of steam sometimes as anyone. But if I'm pushed to acknowledge what is actually going on inside of me, it is the real sense that I am never quite alone. There is always a presence, always a force, always a good at work around me, beyond me, sometimes in spite of me, often within me, that belies explanation. A surprising hope, a surprising support, a surprising agitation, a surprising love. It's what we call grace. It's not of my doing. It's not of my believing. It is not of my preparation. It simply is. I hope you are able to feel it too.